ascoltare.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fourth webinar of the ICCG webinar series on water and climate change. And today's webinar will focus on tackling complexity in a changing climate, the water, energy, food nexus in low-income countries. And the webinar will be given by Louise Karlberg from the Stockholm Environment Institute, where she heads the Resource and Development Unit. Dr. Karlberg has 15 years of experience in the research field of environment and development, and her main research interests are eco-hydrology and environmental physics, with a special focus on water flows in terrestrial ecosystems. From 2012, she has focused her research on the quantifications of the nexus between agriculture, energy, and water sectors, and she has been involved in multi-stakeholder dialogue in low-income countries, especially with a focus on Ethiopia and Zambia. And now I leave the floor to Dr. Karlberg for a 30-minute presentation, and there will be followed by a Q&A time of around 20 minutes. So where you are all cordially invited to ask questions through the GoToWebinar system, or also here in person from our researchers. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the wonderful invitation to come here today and give this presentation. I've really been looking forward to this. So yes, the topic for my talk today is looking at the water, energy, food nexus, and specifically then focusing the discussion on low-income countries, because that is where, like Isabella just said, where I have been working predominantly. So as I'm sure you all are aware, this Nexus animal was born at a conference in Bonn in 2011. And since then, there has been a lot of, I would say, talk about the water, energy, food nexus. There has been a number of conferences, research calls, papers written, and predominantly, I would argue, a lot of these conceptual diagrams that you have here in front of you. This one is from the Stockholm Environment Institute. This is our interpretation of the nexus. But if I can be a little bit provocative, I would say that maybe there has been a lot of talking and a lot of conceptualization, but perhaps a little bit less action on the ground. So therefore, I will try and focus this presentation today and sharing with you a lot of the results that we've had so far and working in 2 concrete case studies on the nexus. So for me, what has been interesting and inspiring about the nexus is that of course, it deals with the interconnectedness of these sectors. So it's not just a one directional link, for instance, between energy and water. It's not just water for energy, for instance. It's really looking at the whole system and the interconnectedness. But it has equally been, for me, starting to always put human aspirations as the starting point. And for me, being a natural scientist by training, I think I came from the schooling where we started looking at resources allocation, and then towards the end it was like, oh, and did we meet any human aspirations? But now we start with the human aspirations instead and putting that as the center. So that for me has been what has been novel also about the nexus. When we started working in my first project, I think I spent a year talking to local partners and stakeholders about the nexus and the interlinkages between food, water, and energy. And people were really, really nice and polite. And they said, oh, Dr. Louise, yes, yes, very important, very nice. But you could sort of see in their faces that they didn't really think that this was really what they needed. And I think that it has got to do with how we communicate this, because one of the challenges with working with the nexus is that it's tremendously abstract and complex. And then, of course, it also tends to become a buzzword. And just within brackets, perhaps a little bit, when I realized that eventually you start to become completely nexusified, you start seeing the word nexus everywhere. So I've had really hilarious experiences lately with cycling to work and going past a car which said Nexus, the access to success. And then I bought a life jacket for my son, and the life jacket is called Nexus. And then I had a flat tire the other day, and realizing when I tried to fix my back tire that my gears on my bike is called Nexus. And then the most funny thing is this photograph that I took also cycling to work, where this is obviously the Stockholm way of looking at the Nexus. www.nexusstockholm.exe SE, that's Thai boxing, CrossFit, and mixed martial arts. So no wonder, I guess, that we have a problem communicating the Nexus to partners and stakeholders. So what I realized this is actually a lot about in low-income countries is underpinning two of the key change processes in low-income countries, and that's got to do with agriculture transformation. So really trying to take agriculture, moving it from the current subsistence practices to a more commercial system, and at the same time also changing the energy sectors, the energy transitions. So in sub-Saharan Africa, where I work predominantly, around 70 to 80% of the current energy sector is biomass-based. So there's a very, very small part which is actually modern energy, electricity then predominantly, of course. So what we have done was that when we started instead talking about agricultural transformations, energy transitions, and how these two processes are linked, then all of a sudden we had the stakeholders and the partners on board. It's like, okay, this is important to us. This is what we want to work on. So this presentation is really going to follow these two key processes and looking at how these processes are linked and zooming into or giving you two examples of two countries where I've worked in. Of course, then the focus is also on climate change and how climate change sort of links with the Nexus. So on the adaptation side, we obviously have an increased need for irrigation in agriculture in future in many of these low-income countries, of course, to bridge expected more frequent droughts and dry spells, but also to adapt to changing growing seasons. On the energy side of things, it's, for instance, got to do with hydropower production and sizing of new dams and the availability of water. On the mitigation side, on the other hand, we have, for instance, in Ethiopia has got a very large livestock population. So they are planning to reduce this livestock population quite substantially in order to mitigate emissions from livestock. And of course, obviously, in the energy sector, there is a need for making this transition of the energy sector as sort of green as possible. So looking at these type of low carbon futures. And many of these climate change mitigation strategies are now being captured in these type of green economy plans that are becoming increasingly common in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. So the first example is from Zambia then, and that's actually work in progress. So the figures I will share with you are preliminary and could change, of course. The issues in Zambia is, first of all, access to modern energy sources. So there is a very, very low access to energy or to modern electricity in rural areas. This is one of the challenges. And the other aspect is, of course, food security. So Zambia is a food insecure country and with very low yielding agriculture. For those of you who know agriculture numbers, they have a productivity which is around 1 to 2 tons per hectare, which is really low in comparison to, for instance, Europe, where we normally have production figures of 5 to 7 tons per hectare. So these are the development challenges. At the same time, they face large issues with deforestation. And why is a bit unclear. It's partly because of expansion of agriculture, but it's also partly because of the need for fuel wood for energy. And at the same time, they face issues in terms of meeting environmental flow requirements because of an increased regulation of rivers for hydropower production. There are strong drivers of change, of course. The population in Zambia currently is between 13 to 14 million people, going up to around 25 by 2030. And very positively, of course, a strong economic growth. So both these drivers put increased pressures on resources. And then we have climate change. So going through the national plans of Zambia, in the energy sector, the biggest push is to increase hydropower production. So currently they have a production of around 2,000 megawatts and hoping to go up to 6,000. And for the agriculture sector, they want to commercialize, and they do that, or the plan is to then create something called farm blocks, which is a type of agricultural lands already equipped with irrigation and power, so that they will basically move different types of farmer groups to these areas to do farming. Of course, there could be a whole lot of equity issues and whatever around that, but I'm not going to go into that at all. But so these are the two sort of planned changes in the energy and agriculture sector. So what we then did was that we started off interviewing a number of stakeholders, and we tried to first of all draw one of these conceptual diagrams to see where do these sectors interlink. So what you have there is you have energy in one of the blue dots here, water down here, and then food, but we've increased that to include all sorts of biomass generation, so not just food production. Out here in the outer circle, we have a lot of environmental impacts, such as soil degradation, horizontal expansion, deforestation, etc. So, looking at this, we've started off looking first at needs for energy, so focusing on this circle. So all these little numbers in yellow here, it pertains to energy. So using the common unit terawatt hours, the anticipated demand for energy in 2030, so then of course accounting for a larger population and improved economic growth, is around 300 terawatt hours. How can we meet this demand? Well, as you recall, I just said in the previous slide, they want to expand hydropower production to 6,000 megawatts. If you convert that, that corresponds to about 50 terawatt hours if you have maximum capacity all the time, which is probably completely unrealistic. So super positive projection says that hydropower could perhaps contribute with 50 to meet these 300. It's clear that there has to be other energy sources to this. So then looking at net primary productivity in forests, so that is the annual increment of biomass every year in a forest, and then trying to convert that to energy units, that amounts to a maximum of 5,000 terawatt hours. That's actually quite substantially more than the 3,000, although we do know that already today we have deforestation issues related to energy or to wood fuel production. Also interesting to note is that energy needs for agriculture is rather small in this context. It's just around 5 to meet the energy needs for these farm blocks. For instance, for irrigation, pumping of water, for mechanization, and for fertilizer production. So that is actually rather small. But of course, this is the big interesting part. How large is biomass? What type of role is biomass going to play in the future? Or is it more going to be solar, geothermal, nuclear, wind, whatever other type of energy sources? And this is, of course, a strategic decision that the energy sector could take. Then moving to the next part, which is the water then. So now all of a sudden we have a new unit, and that's cubic kilometers. The total resource in Zambia annually is about 100 cubic kilometers that you can sort of play with per year. If you want to produce these 6,000 megawatts, then around 95 of those 100 has to pass through turbines somewhere down the line. I am not a hydropower expert. I don't know how realistic that is, but to me it sounds like a very large number, although of course most of that is not consumptive water, it just has to pass through the turbines. Irrigation, on the other hand, is obviously consumptive. So the irrigation needs for these farm blocks, we anticipated to be around 5 out of 100. That might sound a bit small, but remember that this is consumptive water use, and if this is upstream of the turbines, this water has already disappeared before it reaches the turbine. Then we just have 95 less, then every single drop of water has to pass through these turbines. Again, not sure that that is so realistic. And we also have a tropical climate. So during the dry season, we have a lot less water. If you want to run your hydropower plant to maximum capacity, that is probably rather unrealistic. And we already today have issues with meeting environmental flows in sensitive downstream ecosystems. So there's definitely an issue here around water, and it perhaps questions how realistic it is to be able to expand this hydropower up to the 6,000 anticipated. And it also raises the question about what would be the most important thing. Would it be irrigation and expansion of agriculture, where most people today are actually working and getting their income from, or is it really meeting the electricity production in the country, which is also really important. Today, they're already now struggling to meet the demand for electricity in Zambia and importing from the southern power pool that they're part of. And then finally, sort of zooming in on the biomass thing. So again, the supply of biomass in this case means the net primary productivity in different ecosystems. So we've separated the forests from croplands and grazing lands. So 130 there is croplands and grazing lands, the supply of fodder and food, and the 300 is net primary productivity of woody biomass per year. And if we were to meet the whole energy demand by just wood, that would amount to 50. So that is actually just a sixth of the woody biomass. Yet we do know that we have these issues with deforestation. And also meeting sort of national dietary requirements for both vegetarian food and animal products amounts to about 16 megaton dry matter out of 132. So there is actually a large potential, it seems, in Zambia to really utilize these bioresources that they have quite well. It's a very scarcely populated country. It's a very large country. So there seems to be a lot of room for maneuvering here and to sustainably actually use biomass. So the conclusions that we drew from Zambia was that for the agricultural transformations, there definitely seems to be enough energy, although the energy access remains a large issue. For the energy sector, we noted that it will probably continue to depend on biomass. And the question is then, how do we do this more sustainably today? And it could be also partly supplied by the agriculture sector in the future, using wastes and things like that. And it also appears that the agriculture and energy sectors will definitely compete for water in future, and they need to sort of work around this. And they have already today serious sustainability issues that they would need to address. So what can you do with a study like this? Well, we continued then in Ethiopia to go a step further and looking a little bit at drawing these sort of future development pathways for the country, looking at the current development pathways and options well, optional development pathways, focusing a lot on policies. So we took a starting point in different stakeholders and their different conflicting interests and aspirations, and we analyzed the current policy frameworks. And in Ethiopia, the two most interesting ones perhaps is the climate resilient green economy, which is one of these green plans, which really addresses climate change, and the growth and transformation plan. So what we wanted to do then was to assess the impact of different development pathways for different stakeholder groups as well. And of course, after accounting for interactions between the sectors. So we did this for a case study area in Ethiopia. We didn't do it for the whole country. This is the Lake Tana area. This is the origin of the Blue Nile River. It's an absolutely beautiful place. It's up in the highlands in the Amhara region. There are 4 rivers draining into Lake Tana, and they are currently all have been or are being dammed for irrigation purposes. So that's all these gray areas here. And at the same time, the Lake Tana itself is used as a reservoir for hydropower production. So these are the previous beautiful Blue Nile Falls, but now hardly any water leaves the Blue Nile River here anymore. Instead, it's being transferred through the Tana Bellas transfer, which is a large hydropower production. So the whole lake is regulated. And at the same time, there is a large group of fishermen using the lake for fisheries, and it's got fantastic biological, ecological values. There's a large tourism industry interested in the lake, and it's used a lot for navigation. Just like imagining Venice without water, it's sort of hard to drive the boat. They had the same issue. They used the boat to go across like this. So what we did was that we applied a toolkit called WEEP and LEAP, which we developed at TCI. And the advantage with this is that WEEP can help us to address water and food and biomass, while LEAP is an energy planning tool. And because they are dynamically linked, we could actually look at the whole Nexus system. And the tool is also built so that you can quickly do scenarios. The scenario component is sort of integral to this tool. So we look at different scenarios. And we formulated these scenarios jointly with stakeholders. So we got the stakeholders together at the onset of the project, and the stakeholders helped us both to define scenarios, but equally to look at data and assumptions going into the tools and results out of the tools, so that they really critiqued what we, the material that we used in the tools as well. So we came up with 3 stories about the future. One type of reference scenario, which is everything has, all the 3 scenarios contain or accounts for population increase. That remains the same. The first one is a type of reference one where you have a slow development and the national plans don't come about. So it's basically today, but with more people. And then we have the national plans. The national plans in Ethiopia are super ambitious, and Ethiopia is going to become a mid-level economy by 2025, and everything is, agriculture is going to be commercial, everyone's got electricity access, etc., etc. So it's very, very ambitious. And then finally, when we had done this, the stakeholders realized that there were a couple of so-called outstanding dilemmas with the national plans. So we tried to address that and thinking about new policy and innovation needs. So you can say that this one is very top-down. We just looked at the current policy framework, where this is a lot more bottom-up. So this was formulated then by the stakeholders. This is more of a desirable future that we might want. I'm not going to go through all these details. This was just a little bit to illustrate the different assumptions made in the scenario. So perhaps worth noting is are these 2. They have a large issue with biomass scarcity in this region. 90 to 95% of the area is croplands, and they burn everything they can find. They burn the cow dung, they burn the crop residues, or they use the crop residues for fodder. So the agricultural lands are completely cleaned always, which means that you have a decreasing soil health, because you don't return any organic matter and you don't return any nutrients. So soil productivity and crop yields are just going down at the moment. So in the Nexus scenario, we try to address that by returning more of the biomass to the fields, and also the cow dung to the fields after harvest. So this is just one way of plotting a result like this. So you have the 3 different scenarios here. The blue circle is the business as usual, the red one is the national plans, and the green one is the Nexus, for a number of both model inputs and outputs, you could say. So a number of variables showing a little bit the outcome of these different trajectories. So perhaps worth noting is that in the Nexus one, we of course took the food production very seriously. So more agricultural inputs, but at the same time not destroying soil health. So we have a higher food production in this one. Hydropower generation is very low in the Nexus scenario, on the other hand, and that is because in this scenario we maintain the lake level. So we put a cap on how low the lake is allowed to drop, and therefore this severely restricts how much hydropower you produce. So to dive a little bit into the details there, if we zoom into the water, this was basically what I just said. So you have a monsoon or a seasonal, very tropical climate. Here is obviously the rainy season and the dry season. So the issue is maintaining the lake level during the dry season here. So the orange line is where you don't want to go below. So in the Nexus scenario, we really cap this. So hydropower has to cease if you start to approach this. And of course, the consequence of that is that hydropower production is nearly 50% in this scenario compared to the other 2. And this was interesting when we started showing with the stakeholders, because you can imagine EPCO, which is the Ethiopian Power Corporation company, what they thought when they realized that their incomes were sort of reduced by 50%. So then it was a very heated debate, you could say, amongst the stakeholders. Then looking a little bit at the biomass aspects, I already told you that there currently is a tremendous biomass scarcity. So this is a projection out to 2030. So increasing population, you of course increase demand significantly. And this is the really, really scary picture, I think, because so this is what happens by 2030 if population increases and you don't do anything. So you have a demand for biomass which is more or less 3 times as much as the current supply, which is clearly unsustainable. And they will obviously have to rely significantly both on food imports and fuel imports to this region. It's the dark color here is the fuel demand. The middle section here is the fodder demand, and the top part is the food demand. So you can basically try and match them a little bit across like this. So the food demand can be met by grain, the fodder demand can be met by grass, and the wood, the fuel demand is predominantly met by wood, but of course they burn everything. So then in the national plans, the biggest difference is that there the livestock population was significantly reduced. So therefore demand goes down quite a bit in terms of fodder. But still the total demand for biomass is still higher than supply. Also we have a higher supply of biomass because here we have a lot of chemical fertilizer, which pushes up the supply of biomass. And it was only in the Nexus scenario where we really tried hard to ensure that we had sort of managed the biomass scarcity component, that demand and supply totally is matching. But as you can see, the demand for wood fuel is still higher than the supply. And the underlying assumption here was that 40% of this area was going to have access to electricity, which is really high and beyond what we realistically think is going to be achieved. So solving this issue around the energy here is going to be key for this area. And what they have already started doing is that they're actually planting eucalyptus on croplands because they need to get more biomass. So you can imagine what that does to food security in the long run as well. So some concluding remarks. I think that the example, I guess both these examples show that there are strong, both indirect and direct links between energy transitions and agricultural transformations. And it's very important, therefore, that we have platforms for dialogue amongst these stakeholder groups so that they understand the issues that both sectors are facing and have a dialogue on how they can agree on the use of resources, for instance, water. And it's not just trade-offs, there are also opportunities. For instance, in the Ethiopia case, that they are building these irrigation dams. So the agriculture people said that, okay, we are prepared to compromise. We perhaps do not irrigate as much as planned, and we can let some water through during the dry season, which would really help the hydropower people, which struggle during the dry season, right? So there are also, opportunities for dialogue here. The second point there is that there is, of course, resources competition between the sectors, but there is a type of power relation here, because the agriculture sector obviously needs land, water and nutrients to produce food. You can't get around that. While the energy sector can, of course, shift away completely from biomass in Ethiopia and go for other sources of energy, such as water or wind or whatever. Oh, sorry, wind or solar or other sources of energy completely. In terms of climate change, it obviously dictates the transformation of both the energy and the agricultural sector. And I think what we saw in Ethiopia was that a quantitative analysis like the one we did using our tools was very helpful to stimulate dialogue amongst different stakeholders. It can guide both on the sort of softer side, on the policy side. It can guide the implementation of current policy framework. It can guide new policy mechanisms, and it can guide new policy development, really, and sort of help these sectors to steer in a certain direction. But equally important, I think that these type of analyses also help with new investments, new technological innovations that are urgently needed. For instance, both in Zambia and in Ethiopia, we need to come up with some way of electrifying rural areas, and that probably has to be off-grid solutions, because you cannot wait for somebody to draw electricity to your little local village, in particular not in Zambia, which is very scarcely populated, because there is no cost it's simply too expensive. So looking at these type of rural off-gridded solutions is going to be key, I think. And also because the agriculture sector, in order to transform, would need electricity out there. You need good storage. I mean, nobody will want to buy your milk or any of your products if you cannot ensure that it's being stored properly, for instance. So I think those were my key messages, and I'm looking very much forward to hearing your thoughts on this and any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karlberg. That was a very interesting presentation, and it raised a lot of issues around this nexus and around these three, say, competing resources. So let's start from here. Do we have any question from our researchers? Fabio, please.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. Looking at your graph for Ethiopia, which you have the main dimensions of the Nexus on the results, I noticed that as well. I noticed that also in the Nexus scenario there is a problem with electricity access. It is not really related to how much energy you can produce. There is also a reduction in hydropower, but I think the biggest problem is in terms of infrastructure to the rural areas. How is possible to combine also these factor dimension infrastructure requirements? I mean, there is some trade-off when you think about the Nexus, also try to use the access of global disease that is we are quite far from the targets that we can try to achieve. The best scenarios.
This is a little bit of a sensitive issue in Ethiopia, as you might know. So Ethiopia is really expanding largely at the moment in terms of hydropower production. And they're building this big, great Renaissance dam, which is causing a lot of political tension with downstream countries such as Egypt. And I think that the common belief held by most people that we spoke to in Ethiopia was that now that we produce so much hydropower, we will all have electricity. And that is not true, because most people still live out in the rural areas, and even though you have the big power lines, you say that they have they will have 100% grid coverage. That is just the big net over the country. But nobody has really thought of drawing the sort of the last little lines out to the different households. And it's just too expensive. So in the foreseeable future, this is not going to happen. So despite the fact that they probably have enough electricity in total, this is not going to reach the people. So you still have an issue with electricity access. And then the question is, okay, how can we deal with that? Because this is obviously a massive issue. In Ethiopia specifically, there is this interlinkage with biomass and biomass scarcity. So I think that there is a large need for, sort of in the short to medium term, looking at off-gridded rural solutions for energy in some way. It could be biodigesters, it could be mini or micro hydro or solar or whatever, but we really need to look at different type of small systems. And I think maybe thinking about comparing with Europe as well, it's interesting because we now have started seeing the point with connecting our own solar panels and selling our own electricity production to the grid. This is sort of recent developments in Europe. Maybe they can be at the forefront here and start up by doing their sort of isolated systems, and in future when they are connected, it will be an opportunity for them to sell possibly as well. But the whole institutional framework is completely lacking around this, unfortunately. But there are a lot of donors who are interested in investing in this. But I think that there is a lack of financial capital as well. Somebody has to go in and invest in this.
Okay, we have an interesting question from the public concerning this issue, so I would like to raise it. Is there a framework for helping developers build projects that consider the Nexus? It seems most projects focus on electrification rate and on taking into consideration the wider needs, for instance, food and water. So with the reference to off-grid energy.
I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, but what I think is commonly lacking are platforms for dialogue at different levels in different countries. So looking at Zambia, for instance, they have something called sector advisory groups, where the Ministry for Agriculture would meet with the Ministry for Energy and Water, for instance. But these sector groups are very reactive and they are not strategic. So if they were if they met and started talking, I think, more proactively about where is my sector heading, and perhaps underpinning that dialogue with quantitative information, I think that would be more constructive. And I think that is really lacking, because if you have that, you can have more strategic policy development, which is not there today. And that can obviously then also guide new investments.
Yeah, that's very important. Another question, what is the next for the project? Is there, where else may the weak leap model be applied?
Well, I guess I could sell SEI's tool here, right? But our toolkit is not a global tool, so it works at the sub-national to national to regional scales. And of course, we could work with that toolkit wherever there are Nexus issues. But of course, there is no point in just applying a tool if there is not pertinent resources scarcity and interlinkages between sectors. In low-income countries, I think that the interlinkages between sectors become increasingly strong with development as well. So in very poor countries, there are very few interactions, and there is perhaps not the same resource scarcity issues, but these become increasingly stronger with development and with more people. So I think that you can of course apply this toolkit wherever. We've also done it in California. I didn't give that example now, but then the issues are completely different. Then we talk a lot more technology. It's a lot more water for pumping or for cooling of the power station and things like that. So this was providing very much the low-income perspective.
Great, thank you. So I have a question for you. So how is the allocation of resources, such as energy, water, and biomass, optimized between the sectors?
Yes, so that was something which I think has been really helpful in the Ethiopia project. We didn't sort of have a goal to optimize resources. Instead, we had the starting point to meet the aspirations of different sectors. And I think that therefore that there is no such a thing as an optimal allocation of resources, because we all have different aspirations, we all have different needs. So instead, talking about the future we want together is a far better starting point for dialogue, because then it's not so confrontational as well. It's not about negotiating, I want 5 water and you want 3 water. It's more, okay, we have a common future that we want to build. We have different conflicting interests between sectors perhaps, but we can still have an opening space for dialogue, acknowledging that we will never reach an optimal allocation for resources because each single individual has their optimal allocation perhaps.
Good. We have other questions. So which type of policy instruments are considered in each case study to regulate the different Nexus situations?
Ooh. In Zambia, we haven't really looked at any policy instruments yet, because this is really at the beginning of this project. But in Ethiopia, we looked at the different national plans, and we didn't really look at the different policy mechanisms. We just assumed that the goals stipulated in the national plans would actually materialize in one way or the other. In some cases, we actually had problems because the goals were slightly conflicting, but that was how we did that.
Great. I have a question related to institutions, which also linked to another question we see. So what institutions are needed to achieve efficient sector integration? Do you think we need like a Nexus institution?
No, I don't. I think that we should rather try and build on existing processes and platforms. And I think Zambia, for instance, there is a good example. We should rather work with what is already working. So we have these cross-sector groups. Try and support them and underpin something that is already working is going to be far better than trying to generate some super institution, both at the national level, but we can also imagine at the global level, I guess, like a UN body, a Nexus UN body, I don't think would be really helpful.
Okay, so how would it be possible to make sure that international agreements on climate change are based on a kind of integration of the results of such bottom-up nexus analysis?
That's a very difficult question to respond to. I think I have not worked really at the global scale, so I struggle to respond to that a little bit. I have worked sort of at lower levels, but I think that there are opportunities today to really assess different development trajectories also at the global level, taking into account sort of global steering mechanisms. The SDGs might be one, but also perhaps zooming into Europe, thinking about, for instance, the Water Framework Directive is one of these sort of large-scale policies, and analyzing how that plays out together with similar agricultural and energy policies at the European level.
Great, thank you. There is a question regarding solar energy. So why solar energy isn't given a greater place in the discussion concerning, especially concerning Ethiopia case, because it does not compete for biomass or natural or water, and at the same time is conducive for off-grid applications.
Okay, so I should admit to the fact that I am not an energy expert at all. I come a lot more from the water and food side of things. If I understand it correctly, the problem with solar is that it's still a little bit too expensive. Ethiopia is a very, very poor country, despite the very high economic growth lately, and so is Zambia, that the cost for solar is still rather unaffordable for most villages. On the other hand, it seems that the cost for solar PV is going down. So this is my understanding of the solar.
But if you include the opportunity costs of biomass-based hydropower, would it be competitive? If you're thinking about these sort of future constraints.
I don't know. I guess because it hasn't happened, it has been because, I mean, it's been too expensive for now, but perhaps in future. I actually don't know.
So we have a question here. Why hydropower is lowering the level of the lake? Isn't it linked to evaporation, or are there any other reasons?
Oh, well, sure. Of course, there is a lot of evaporation from the lake, but what they did was that when they built in this case, the Tana-Bellis transfer, they made the threshold from the lake far below that sustainability threshold, if you so wish. So it's fully possible to draw down the lake level quite a lot if you want to, and that is what EPCO does want if it wants to make money.
Mm-hmm. And in the calculation of food demand, only national food demand is considered, or also linked to export?
That's a great question. So for Zambia, when I showed the number there, it was just the national food requirements. But of course, there are great ambitions to export food in that case. And we should definitely look into that and the export potential, because of course this is one large driver for economic development in Zambia, and something that they're looking into. And if I can sort of expand on that, I think in general these analyses, one of the weak points here is that we haven't really looked at the cost. I mean, that also relates to the question about solar PV. We need to really work far more with economists than what we have hitherto done, I think, to looking at different income, sort of the difference between different income generations between these different scenarios, to really see, and also for who, because I think that there are strong equity aspects in this. If you invest in agriculture, for instance, it might be so that you might perhaps make less money in terms of GDP, but it's more evenly distributed amongst people, while if you invest a lot in hydropower production, a country such as Ethiopia can sell the hydropower and make a lot of money for Ethiopia in general, but it's not sure that this sort of trickles down to the people. So I think that we need to have a far better understanding about the economy behind this and the equity aspects to this as well.
Sure. And so another question, throughout the project lifespan, have you ever encountered innovative initiatives at the local level that somehow, even though most probably only partially already try to address the nexus?
Oh, plenty, absolutely. I think that there are a lot of initiatives out there, and they all sort of, or many of them, suffer from the traditional problem in like innovations often have in low-income countries, is scalability. So they work great when it's sort of managed by an NGO somewhere, but for whatever reason, we seem to have still an issue with making these innovations large scale. And that, I think, pertains again to the financial aspects, that we have perhaps not really thought through the financing behind them. I mean, take water harvesting schemes, for instance. That's just one example, or, yeah.
Great. And so we have a question concerning linked to health. So how would you consider the health sector response to situations like this, in which the food production is endangering nutrition and health safety?
Yes, that is a brilliant question. I think one of the areas where we haven't really understood the health impacts is what happens if you really run out of fuel wood, for instance, in rural communities. So you cannot cook your food. You have beans, you can't cook. You have maize, you can't anymore make your maize porridge. How is that going to impact on the nutritional status of a village? Or are we therefore going to change the type of food we have to eat, for instance? So I think this is a complete big unknown at the moment, which needs further attention.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So could you elaborate a little bit more on how acceptable the Nexus scenarios was or has been to the stakeholders that you interviewed?
Well, let me just respond in terms of Ethiopia. So what we did was that we had a number of workshops throughout the whole project, 4 or 5 of them. So what we did was that at the onset, we presented a business as usual and a national plan scenario, which was very much desktop work. And the third scenario, the Nexus scenario, was then formulated by the stakeholders as a response to the results we showed. In hindsight, I would have wanted to do it in a more participatory way, if I should be honest. It would have been better to start off with a workshop where we were not prescriptive at all, more or less, but just providing perhaps the type of information I've shown for Zambia today. This is what it looks like. What do you think could be the challenges? What type of scenarios would you be interested in us exploring? It would have been even better to do it in that way in Ethiopia, and that is how we will be doing it now in Zambia.
Thank you. So what measures did you have in mind to induce the diet demand changes in the non-business as usual scenario, or you only consider supply?
Can you read the question?
Yes,
again?
sure. So what measures did you have in mind to induce the diet demand changes in the non-business as usual scenario, or you only considered supply?
We did not assume any changes in terms of diet demand. So we've only assumed that most people eat 80% vegetarian food and 20% animal products at a diet which is considered a healthy diet. And that doesn't change. So of course we can have dietary scenarios which are more sort of in line with that you do change your diet when your income changes, etc. But we didn't do that.
Okay. So we have a last question from the webinar system. So while building those scenarios, do you consider also pressure generated from potential climate change migrations from neighbor countries or other climate change potential effects?
Oh, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, there are a lot of these things that we sort of, at the scale of things, that's a sort of at the bigger scale, which we didn't account for. We did not account for exports or imports into our case study region. We did not account for migration of people in and out. We actually hardly accounted for increased urbanization, but that was actually the only thing we really did. So I think that this is also something which we need to understand better, this issue of scales, because this has been, from a research point of view, was a large methodological challenge, because the water and environment people, they tend to work at the basin scale, and the energy people tend to work at the national scale. And the same with the stakeholders. Most of your energy stakeholders are national, and most of your water environmentalists, they sit at the subnational scale. So just to get our two tools, in this case, to talk to each other, on a spatial scale was a challenge. And I think that even if we solve that technical issue, as long as we're not working on a global scale, we will always have these issues with trade, right? So what goes in and out of our systems, our boundaries, and that also pertains to more sort of social indicators in terms of migration of people and things like that. So I think that's luckily for us researchers, we're not done. So that's another challenge that we need to address.
Thank you very much, Louise, for this very interesting presentation, and I think that also the questions were very, very on the topic. So thanks so much to everybody. So I take the chance to give 2 announcements. So the first is that we've just launched Best Climate Practice contest. So the issue of this year contest is water for food production. So it's really linked to today's webinar. So you're all welcome to apply and to disseminate this information. The deadline for the submission of best practice is the 15th of July. The other announcement is that the next webinar will be held on the 9th of June, always at 12 p.m. And it will be given by Martin Fussell from the European Environment Agency, and it will be on water security, climate change adaptation, and risk mitigation. So thank you very much again, and to everyone, also to our auditors, and of course to our speaker. Thank you so much, and see you next webinar. Bye bye.